Hi, and welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. Texas Monthly recently reported that with more than 80 million books in print, she's the most successful author in Texas, and the steamiest. Sandra Brown is the world-famous author in question, whose blockbuster novels are filled with murder, deceit, suspense, and one steamy sex scene after another. Since 1981, she's published over 100 novels, many of which have made the New York Times bestseller list for fiction either in hardback or paperback, an incredible statistic that only a handful of authors like Stephen King and Danielle Steele have been able to match. Brown is regarded as a master of escapist American pop fiction. SheWrites.com has crowned her as notorious for the singular style of romantic suspense she has pioneered over the past 5 decades, kicking off her first prolific era of publishing way back in 1981 with Love's Encore, and then Love Beyond Reason, Eloquent Silence, A Treasure Worth Seeking, Primetime, Hidden Fires, The Silken Web, Not Even for Love, Seduction by Design, A Kiss Remembered, A Secret Splendor, Words of Silk, Bittersweet Rain, Tiger Prince, Sweet Anger, Above and Beyond, Honor Bound, Two Alone, The Thrill of Victory, Tomorrow's Promise, Relentless Desire, Heaven's Price, Temptation Kiss, In a Class by Itself, Thursday's Child, Tilly in the Morning, The Rana Look, 22 Indigo Place, Sonny Chandler's Return, Demon Rum, Tidings of Great Joy, Hawk O'Toole's Hostage, Long Time Coming, Temperatures Rising in a Whole New Light. Brown continued that hit streak with the Bed and Breakfast series, the Coleman Family Saga series, the Mason Sisters duology, and the Texas Tyler Family Saga series, before breaking out into a worldwide best-selling romantic suspense sensation, beginning with Slow Heat in Heaven, then continuing with bestseller after bestseller including Best Kept Secrets, Mirror Image, Breath of Scandal, French Silk, Shadows of Yesterday, Where There's Smoke, Charade, Love Beyond Reason, The Witness, Fat Tuesday, Unspeakable, The Alibi, Standoff, The Switch, and Envy, where USA Today celebrated her as a masterful storyteller. As her popularity exploded into new generations of readers throughout the millennium, CBS News reported that if you've been inside a bookstore in the last 20 years or scrolled through a list of top 10 ebooks, chances are you're familiar with the name Sandra Brown. Each of her last 15 books has been to the top of the New York Times bestseller list, including new hits like The Crush, Hello Darkness, White Hot, Chill Factor, Ricochet, Play Dirty, Smokescreen, Rainwater, Smash Cut, Tough Customer, Lethal, Low Pressure, Deadline, Friction, Sting, Seeing Red, Tailspin, Outfox, Thick as Thieves, and her more recent bestsellers, Overkill, Out of Nowhere, Mean Streak, and Blood Moon. She's the rightful recipient of multiple awards, including the International Thriller Writers Award and Romance Writers of America's Lifetime Achievement Awards. And she joins us today to talk all about her legendary career as one of the world's top romantic suspense masters. Sandra, thank you so much for taking out time to be with us. Now, as one of the greatest suspense novelists of your time, can we assume that you grew up reading a lot of Nancy Drew and any romance by chance?
Someone asked in an interview last week, what do you remember reading first? And I think the first thing I remember reading, and nobody will probably remember these, they were called the Bobbsey twins. And it was two girls about 10 years old, and they had a series of books. But then I was a Nancy Drew addict. I mean, just read Nancy Drew books over and over and over again. I probably read the whole series like 4 times each book. And then I remember my mother had a really attractive, I wish I'd give anything if I had them, really attractive volume of Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre. And they were illustrated and they came in a sleeve. I can just see them. And I read those when I was probably in junior high. And then I started reading all of these sprawling saga type books, adventure books like Irwin Shaw and Thomas Costain and Frank G. Slaughter, and then gravitated into, the Agatha Christie, a lot of English writers who wrote suspense, Evelyn Anthony. And so it just, but I always read everything. No, and Daddy would do book reviews for extra money. And so publishers would send the newspaper, all of these books, and he would get them. And about once a month, bring a box, a box load home, and it was like a treasure trove to me. I would dig through there and probably read a lot that was inappropriate, age inappropriate at the time. But that's why I just read everything I could get my hands on constantly. And then going to the library, we had a bookmobile, but we always went to the library and checked out as many books as allowed. And that was, big treat, especially in the summertime.
Did you have a local librarian that helped you expand that catalog of books before you began building such a famous one of your own?
If they had a whole shelf, like Bernard Cornwell, and all of these series, and if I discovered somebody like that, then I had a whole shelf, of books to read.
What about once you were studying English at Texas Christian University? Any professors who guided you as your talent was first finding its way to the page?
You were talking about the influence, the one person reading. When I was in freshman English composition class at TCU, that we were assigned a theme, and we had to write kind of an essay kind of thing on John Donne's quote, "No man is an island." And so we knew what we were going to write about, but we couldn't take any notes in. We had to write it in a blue book under a given, class period time. And the professor read my theme to the class as an example. And so, but he still gave me a B plus. And to this day, I don't know why I didn't get an A on that paper. But anyway, that's when I first kind of knew, maybe I had some talent, for writing, because it wasn't difficult for me. Doing math or algebra or geometry or any of that didn't interest me in the least, but I loved history and I loved my writing classes, my literature classes.
Your pre-noveling career included stints as a weathercaster before promoting to Dallas-Fort Worth as an investigative reporter for WFAA-TV's PM magazine. Were you also burning the midnight oil working on your first novel back then as well?
I think always in the back of my mind, and I love my days working in television. It was always a part-time job. I was a contributor on a magazine show, and then I did the weather. When you didn't have to be a meteorologist, you just had to say it was either going to be hot or cold or sunny or rainy, But anyway, I loved that work, but I wasn't going to be a threat to anybody with going further into that. And I started writing, Jake, when I got fired from that job, because they came through one day and they said, all of you who are on air now, we want to replace with fresh faces. And so by then I had 2 children. They were toddlers and not even in preschool yet. And my husband at the time actually said, "You've always said you would love to write stories and you're so interested in that. And so you can talk about it or you can do it. And you've got time and opportunity now. It's something you don't have to get childcare to do." And so that's when I started.
Now, for those just discovering your catalog, as we ran down on the opening remarks, Women's Magazine was correct when they crowned you a truly prolific writer, because that's what you became, promising that writing a little something for everyone, you're bound to find a Sandra Brown book you absolutely love. When you and romance first found each other with your 1981 debut Love's Encore, before the fountain of follow-ups came, what do you look back on most fondly from the writing of that first novel?
I didn't know that I could do it, but I really, I wanted to. And so we got a card table set up in a spare room of the house and bought an IBM Selectric typewriter and a few reams of paper, and that's where I started.
After you published this first book under the pseudonym Rachel Ryan, more romances followed throughout the early 1980s under the same pen name with Love's Encore, Love Beyond Reason, Eloquent Silence, A Treasure Worth Seeking in Prime Time, And proving early on just how inspired you were, you began juggling 2 careers at once, working under Laura Jordan writing historical fiction with Hidden Fires and then The Silken Web at the same time, with Not Even for Love. And between then and 1986, wrote another 20 novels as your pen was ablaze, writing Seduction by Design, A Kiss Remembered, A Secret Splendor, Words of Silk, Bittersweet Rain, Tiger Prince, Sweet Anger, and Above and Beyond, then topping it all off by entering a 4th romance category at the same time with Bantam Doubleday's Dell love-swept hits like Tomorrow's Promise, Relentless Desire, Heaven's Price, Temptation's Kiss, Tempest and Eden, In a Class by Itself, Thursday's Child, Riley in the Morning, The Rana Look, and 22 Indigo Place. Please talk about your pioneering days back then, carving out your own niche in the genre. And as a bonus, you actually have a pretty touching story about how you came up with one of these pseudonyms. CBS News once quipped in an interview that chances are you're familiar with the name Sandra Brown. And by the second half of the 1980s, whether on bookshelves or at the mall or spin racks at the corner drugstore or the airports all around the world, courtesy of a red-hot streak your imagination was on, with new bestsellers now being written under Sandra Brown throughout the rest of the decade with Honor Bound, Two Alone, The Thrill of Victory, Sonny Chandler's Return, Demon Rum, Tidings of Great Joy, Hawk O'Toole's Hostage, Long Time Coming, Temperature Rising in a Whole New Light, where the Toronto Sun raved that Brown's storytelling gift is surprisingly rare. You continued to populate the shelves with series during the same amazing period of output with the Bed and Breakfast duology with Breakfast in Bed and Send No Flowers. The historical romance Coleman Family Saga series with Sunset Embrace and Another Dawn. The Mason Sisters duology with Fantasy and Adam's Fall. And the Texas Tyler Family Saga series with Texas Lucky, Texas Chase, and Texas Sage. Please delve into your extensive expertise and share the Sandra Brown romance rules of the road with the aspiring author that might be watching.
With. So I said, I want to make them longer. I want to develop these characters a little bit more. Their stories will intertwine. And the last time I looked, they were in their 45th printing domestically. So they resonated, I think, with a lot of readers. But I think one reason they did is because I had so much fun with the characters.
Did you ever wrestle with the should they wind up together or not question?
No, because I knew from the beginning that they were always going to wind up. I wouldn't do that to myself. I did one story, a book called Rainwater, which was a departure. It wasn't a romance. It was a historical novel set in the Depression. And it was just a story that just begged me to tell it. These characters just would not leave me alone. So it wasn't under contract. Not even my agent knew that I was writing it. I'd work on it between contract books. And it turned out to be a book that charmed and really touched on an emotional level.
Now, you successfully fused your expertise in writing romance at the end of the 1980s with another side of your imagination. You would next quite successfully fuse your skill for writing romance with that of suspense by the end of the 1980s, kicking off a new era of bestsellers with Slow Heat in Heaven, Best Kept Secret in 1989. You broke out into the mainstream as the Associated Press took note and raved that Sandra Brown proves herself top-notch. And Mirror Image in 1990, which spent 5 weeks on the New York Times bestseller chart, your first, and launched the next decade and age of your catalog with another hit, Breath of a Scandal in 1991. When you reflect back about making the transition over the course of those titles, what do you remember giving you the biggest rush as your fingers were racing away taking you there?
The liberation, because I had, as I said, I'd written almost 50 romances, I guess. And I wanted to, expand. I wanted to expand my audience. I wanted to expand creatively. Being able not to have any restrictions, any parameters. I wanted to write a standalone book that wasn't part of a series. And by series, I mean, publishers have published Silhouette or Intimate Moments or Ecstasy, and I would write for those lines. It wasn't like the books fit together. It was just that, they were under an imprint. But I wanted to do my own thing, see how far I could go in terms of broadening my career, expanding it, getting more readers. So my agent and I went to a publisher and said, I'm kind of up for grabs at this stage in my career. And while she was kind of negotiating and feeling out the different publishers and editors and so on, I was writing this book, and I didn't have to censor myself, and so I remember when it first came out and people were reading it, it was like, she used to be such a nice girl. What happened? But it was so liberating, not to have to conform. And so that really was a big stepping stone. And then I wrote the next book. I had a 3-book contract, and the next book was and then I wrote Mirror Image, and that was my first New York Times. That was a big leap. Before I ever wrote Slow Heat in Heaven, which was kind of what they called a breakout or a crossover book. And so I had a lot of practice. It changed my life. It absolutely changed my life. I was no better writer the day after I made the list than the day before, but it's that acknowledgement. And it immediately, catapults you into a new category, into a new level, strata. I remember, just thinking of all the authors who had gone before, who were called New York Times bestseller so-and-so. And now for the rest of my life, if that were the only time that I'd made the list, if I'd only made it for that 1 week, I would still be New York Times bestselling author Sandra Brown. And so that was a very important distinction. And in my mind, the books were still as hard to write. It wasn't like there was some magic, formula that opened up all of these avenues of creativity. I still had to bang my head against the wall every day, but it was the perception of the buying market, and it was the perception of the publishers, the perception of my colleagues. So it made a huge difference.
French Silk, later adapted into the film of the same title, demonstrated your gift for creating these amazing worlds like the one Claire Laurent finds herself in the midst of throughout the New Orleans-based murder mystery. Would you give us a peek inside what it looks like when you're creating this all in your imagination?
It's like watching a stage, like a proscenium with actors and sets. And most of the time, I mean, I know when I start, I know who my main characters are going to be. But I put them into place, give them, as I think Dean Koontz calls terrible trouble, put them in terrible trouble as quickly as possible, and set them up, and then wait and see who shows up. I mean, typically my best characters are people that just walk into the scene, and I'll go, well, who are you? And they'll start talking to the protagonist or antagonist, and it's like, I like this character. I like this is an interesting, this person adds something or detracts, or it can be somebody in disguise that they don't see as a potential threat until they are. Anything like that. But they introduce themselves to me. I don't ever feel like I really create anything so much as I report what my imagination sees and hears. I remember exactly, don't ask me about every book, but I do remember that one. I was doing housework one morning, and the radio was on, and it was Helen Reddy's Delta Dawn. It was Delta Dawn. What's that flower you've got on? Could it be from days gone by? And did you ever hear him say he would meet you here today, take you to his mansion in the sky? Well, that character of Delta Dawn, a jilted, Southern belle, and so that's who I made Claire's mother, and that's where I first got kind of a Blanche DuBois, kind of character. So and then I was a big fan of the Victoria's Secret catalog. I used to get it in the mail, about every third day they'd have a new one. And I thought, it would be interesting to have a heroine who owns a company like that. And I thought, what could I call it? And we were at dinner one night, and I saw on the menu a dessert called French Silk. And it was French silk pie. And I thought, that's the name of the company. So all of those things I remember about creating that book.
Fascinating. USA Today would hail you as a masterful storyteller, carefully crafting tales that keep readers on the edge of their seats. As your second decade rolled on, with bestsellers like Shadows of Yesterday, Where There's Smoke, Charade, Love Beyond Reason, The Witness, Exclusive, Fat Tuesday, Unspeakable, and The Alibi, before kicking off the next generation of your career in 2000 with back-to-back hits in Standoff and The Switch, along with other new bestsellers that mainstream critics like Cosmopolitan promised readers were jam-packed with twists and turns right up to the shocking finales, including Envy, The Crush, Hello Darkness, White Hot, Chill Factor, and Ricochet, where Texas Monthly spotlighted your worldwide loyalty you'd built by then when they noted impressively that Brown is now one of only a handful of authors who are regarded as masters of escapist American pop fiction. As Play Dirty is released in hardcover, Ricochet, your 2006 bestseller about a murder investigation involving a glamorous wife of a rich Georgia judge, is coming out in paperback with an initial printing of 1.5 million copies. You'd round out this next era of your catalog with Smokescreen and the Miller Associates duology with Smash Cut and Tough Customer. When you look back on it all, any among these you had the best time writing? From the research or say characters you conjured up and had the most fun playing with on the page?
Well, I remember in Charade, it's about I got the idea from listening to an interview of a heart recipient and the donor family. And they were talking about, how there was a transference of traits. And the surgeon, the transplant surgeon, was sitting there, saying everything they were saying was poppycock because, the heart is a pump. It's 4 clips, you take it out, then you stitch up 4 places and you hope it starts beating. And that's it. It's just a body part. So I thought, well, what if you loved somebody for the heart that was inside them, that it had belonged to a loved one? And I think there have been books written about that. But I thought, as I said, I'm always flipping it. What if you hated somebody for the heart that they got? What if you had hated the person who had that heart and you wanted to see that heart destroyed? That's where I got the idea for charade. And it was really interesting because I had to find somebody who was actually a recipient who would talk to me about it. And the organ banks and, everybody, all of those records are so sealed. I couldn't get anybody to talk to me at all. But finally, there was an organ bank in Dallas, and I told the woman what I was doing, and she said, well, there's no way that we can do that, but I'll tell you what I'll do. She said, I have someone in mind who just might, because she speaks on behalf of, donorship, and she might just be willing. Let me give her, and I met this young woman. She was great. We had several sessions together. She taught me through her whole process from beginning to end, and she'd been alive for 3 or 4 years with her new heart. So that was interesting. In terms of character, one fan favorite book is Envy. And I think I had a lot of empathy for Parker because he was the writer, and he lived a very solitary, existence, and so I that seems to be a fan favorite, and it was a book within a book, which was also it was difficult to write, challenging, but I liked that book. Also liked The Witness. I liked the amnesia viewpoint, and actually that book was optioned either 2 or 3 times for a movie, and for various reasons, those Hollywood hiccups that you have nothing to do with, but I got paid money that I spent for the options, but it really, it would have been a good movie to make.
Would you unravel a bit for viewers about your process for weaving a story together, from plotting to surprises, which for most of your peers seems to be the best part of the journey?
Most of the surprises, I build in some. I think I used to plot more than I do now. And I think that may have to do with, I trust my instinct. If you want to say ability, maybe I trust my ability more than I did when I first started out. So I wanted to make sure that I had the plot. I didn't really do a scene by scene, chapter by chapter outline, but I would have a synopsis of 10 or 12 pages. And I would have, the characters and what was going to happen, what was going to happen here, what was going to happen here. And then I got to the end, I knew where I was going. I still know where I'm going to start, what the terrible trouble is going to be. I build in certain spikes where the terrible trouble just got more terrible. And then I know how it's going to end. So I know where I'm going. I don't know how I'm going to get there. And for me, part of the fun of it, there are days when it's somewhat fun. There are some days it's just awful. It's just torture. But some of the fun part for me is not knowing everything. because then I get to experience it in a way that the reader does, and so I don't see a lot of the surprises happening until they happen, and then it's like, damn, I'm good, but it's like, oh gosh, I didn't see that coming. And so then it'll complicate the story. It gives me juice for the next 5 or 6 chapters, but I do follow very closely. There's a book by a guy named Christopher Vogler called The Writer's Journey. And to me, it's the Bible. It is so good. It is about classic myth telling. And it's taken from Joseph Campbell, the hero with 1,000 faces. It's about the classic myth and all of the archetypes and how you structure a story, where the transitions have to come. And he wrote it mostly for screenwriters, but it applies to novelists also, because it's all about storytelling, how to tell the story. And when you strip it all down, and I didn't even know I knew how to do this. I didn't know I was doing it. But it was actually my son who turned me on to this book about 10 or 12 years ago. And he said, it's really thick, it's very daunting, but he writes it in such a conversational way. He said, I think you'll really get a lot out of it. And it was just like, oh my gosh, I can't believe. But when I started all of these elements that he talked about, that a story has to have or should have, and I thought, okay, let me see what I did in this. And I pull a book that I wrote 25 years ago and open it up, and I'd say, okay, there's this archetype. That's the herald. This is the mentor. This is I knew all of these things on an instinctual level. And I don't know how that was, but it was like my storytelling followed this kind of, path. And I think it was because I had read so much that I had absorbed it by osmosis, and just reading so many stories that the kind of how to do it had sunk in without my knowing it. But anyway, I still don't know how to do it. I sit down every morning terrified that I won't know. I won't have another idea. This is going to be crap that nobody wants to read. And I really think the fear factor is a tremendous motivator. And I think it also keeps me keen. It keeps me sharp. It keeps me from becoming complacent and just phoning it in. I could never do that anyway.
Well, you certainly avoided that over your 4th decade in the business, and by the 2010s it earned what had really become a legendary career that showed no signs of slowing, as the suspense kept readers as far out on the edge of their seats as ever, with new bestsellers like Lethal, a literary ride that the Library Journal found to be fast-paced and full of surprises. Adding that this taut thriller, marking the author's return to Grand Central, features a large cast of superbly drawn characters and the perfect amounts of realistic dialogue and descriptive prose. Low Pressure, Deadline, Mean Streak, which popular blog site at the time, Reading Cafe, cheered on as another of Sandra Brown's wonderful romance thrillers. The ending was a wild climax filled with surprises. Friction, Sting, and Seeing Red, where Harlequin Junkie proved equally thrilled as their creative counterparts. Their reviewer reporting that one thing I can say that of course you know just by picking up one of Sandra Brown's books that you're in for a wild ride. What's your secret to keeping the creative fires ablaze after so many years of doing this? Maybe using any of these bestsellers as examples.
I think if I challenge myself with each book, doing something different, then it, experimenting with something, it keeps me on my toes. It keeps it from getting dull for me, but it really keeps it from getting dull for the reader and predictable. I remember writing Seeing Red, and that was based on the Oklahoma City bombing, because my children, they're 2 years apart. My children were both at University of Oklahoma at the time. And Norman, where the university is like 30 miles from Oklahoma City. But my daughter actually had classes in the medical center in Oklahoma City. She was downtown that morning. They felt the building shake, the floor shake, the windows blew out. And she was not a pre-med, she was speech therapy. But all the pre-med students got up and ran to the scene. She was trying to get back to campus, but they had shut down the city. So she'd go down one street, she couldn't get back. Meanwhile, my son was in Norman and everybody was hearing about this. And I mean, it affected our lives because my daughter's graduation, it happened in April the 19th, I believe 18th or 19th. And she graduated May 10th. So it was 3 weeks away from her graduation. And everybody was wearing blue ribbons that day in memory of those who had died and honoring those who had survived. There were a couple of survivors that spoke at the graduation ceremony. So it was a very real thing to us. I had a friend who was ATF agent who lived where I live, but he went to Oklahoma City. I was up there for like 6 weeks. So it was a very, memorable thing for us. So I built the story around that. And I got halfway through that book. It was at the halfway point when something has to flip. There has to be instead of your book sinking in the middle, there should be something in the middle that, oh, we thought we were going this way, but wait a minute, we got to go this way. And I was stuck on that for like 3 weeks. And I'd go home at night, curl up in my chair with my head in my hands, cry, say, I can't do this anymore. It's left me. Whatever it was, I'm just going to do this anymore. And it was miserable. And I woke up one morning, I go, well, that was so easy. I have it now. And I sat down and I finished the book. But it was, I remember that particular time, and I don't know what was going on in my life at the time that may have caused that, but I really did have writer's block. And what I did, as you said, you keep writing. You don't give in to it, you keep writing. I would go back at the beginning and do my rewrites and do more rewrites and do more rewrites. But I put in the time. I didn't just stop, I put in the time. But I was thinking, what's gonna be that flip? What's gonna come next? And that was scary. And that's happened more than once, but I remember that one vividly.
Airborne adventures are so cool when suspense novels are set aboard them, especially when piloted by real-life characters known as freight dogs, which are basically truck drivers in the sky. Please introduce viewers to how Ryan Millett first flew into your imagination and how the story took off from there in one of your most recent bestsellers, Tailspin.
I loved that character. I love aviation. I'm fascinated with aviation, and pilots to me just make good heroes. I've used them in several books. But I was asked said, have you ever heard of a freight dog? I said, I have no idea what you're talking about. Said, well, it's a pilot that he can work for UPS, be uniformed and everything. They're pilots that fly, commercially, but it's always cargo. It's not, passengers. Or it can be a guy with a, Cessna who's flying drugs between Texas and Mexico, so said but it's a freight dog. And I said, that would be a good character for you. So I thought, right, it would. So I Googled freight dog and I got in on all of the alert on all of these websites and blog sites and everything where they would talk back and forth. They'd have chat rooms with them and they would be talking about their particular stuff. And they're a breed. It's kind of like Sons of Anarchy, except they're airplanes instead of motorcycles, but Some of them are a pretty rough crowd, and then others are, older men who used to fly commercially and now they have a plane. And if you need to fly a boa constrictor from one place to another, they'll do it. And so I thought these guys could fly drunk or sober, one eye closed, they just know how to fly. They just know how to feel an airplane. And so I thought that that would make a good character. That's where he came from. And then I thought, what's he going to be flying that everybody wants? What everybody wants a piece of it. So what can he be flying? And it went from there.
Outfox reminds us of real-life smarmy conmen like Matt Matthews, Charles Ponzi, or Richard Bailey, who romance and then fleece vulnerable victims out of their fortunes. And Western Graham feels frighteningly real in Outfox. What's it like having to assume an identity like that on the page?
The idea for that came from a news story, one of a television, like one of those magazine shows where they do true crime things. And this character had gone around and fleeced women for years. They could not catch him. And the FBI, they looked for him for years and years and years and finally nailed him down. And I thought, how in the world does somebody get away with that for so long? How much of a chameleon would you have to be? How smart would you have to be? And the only person that could catch him would be somebody that was equally as smart and equally as capable of pulling off a con. And so I thought, so my hero is going to be able to outfox the fox. So that's where that story idea came from. But I think, and the character that was in Overkill is very much, the same kind of he's a total Eben, total sociopath. He's smarter than everybody, and the rules don't apply to him just because he's him. He has no conscience, no sense of right or wrong. He doesn't care who he hurts. Self-gratification is the name of the game, and that's it. He's a Ted Bundy, just totally untouchable just because he's who he is in his mind. But I once heard somebody say, and I think it's true, that the villain is the hero of his own story, that he feels like he's sanctified, he's justified. He doesn't need any excuses for doing what he does. It's pretty good thought every time you start creating a villain. It's got to be somebody that's pretty bad, or you don't worry about your protagonist.
What stayed necessary for you to really achieve that fear factor with antagonists you brought to life on the page throughout the years for yourself and by extension the readers?
Well, that rule, he's the hero of his own story. He's in his mind, he's doing the right thing. Even if it's the wrong thing, it's okay for him to do it. And it has to be somebody pretty formidable, because if it's a puny villain, then your reader is not going to be concerned about your protagonist overcoming that character. So it has to be somebody pretty frightening, pretty scary, seamy, totally repugnant to anybody with a conscience or any sense of decency. Well, certainly Eben. I think one of the best, and I can't remember his name now, but it was the character in Smash Cut, who was the movie aficionado, and he would kind of act out the villains in movies. And he was smart, and he was wealthy, and he was untouchable in his own mind. He could do what he wanted. And I thought, and he was very good looking. And I think that's another, and I've had some awful ones too, like Jigger Flynn in Slow Heat in Heaven was just, trash, just awful, a terrible person that you would want to avoid. But I think some of the best villains are the ones that are seducers. They're seductive, like the devil is reputed to be. They seduce, and you don't see that you've been had until it's too late, you know. And I think the more attractive and the more seductive they are, almost the scarier they are.
We look forward to airing Sandra's episode on the streaming network in the near future, but for right now, we're excited to talk to her about her latest releases. By 2020, your hometown paper, the Dallas Morning News, mused that Brown deserves her own genre. And as one who writes masterfully from both the male and female protagonist points of view, take Arden Maxwell as an example, who composes a lead character the readers are really going to want to follow from page 1 through the conclusion of a novel like Thick as Thieves, that real book spy praise to some of your best work to date.
Whether it be the male or female protagonist, and I write a lot from the male point of view, as you know, but my females, I never want to compromise on their femininity. I always want them to be feminine in their heart, but strong. That doesn't compromise their strength of character. They're all braver than I am. They all have a whole lot more courage. I'm a card-carrying coward. I'm scared of everything. But in a way that helps me write, because, you know, things do frighten me. I'd start typing, my palms get damp, you know, but Arden, like I think all of my other heroines, have had the strength to face up to, first of all, her sister, you know, and then secondly, the people that, you know, were after her. And the same way that that occurred in Overkill, that Kate, you know, she was pretty gutsy to even address Zach right away, that he would be intimidating. And so, particularly because I made her very petite, and here's a football player, you know, and so, but I want all of my women to be smart, intelligent, to be courageous, but also never to be compromised on their femininity from the inside. Not necessarily from the outside, but from the inside.
Now, you're one of the masters at opening a book like an action film might open on the silver screen, especially when you have a veteran just home from the war jumping from a moving freight train in the opening pages of Blind Tiger, which would earn similar accolades across all your generations of readers. What for you is really required to hook the reader from page 1 and keep readers turning them as expertly as you have for so many bestsellers over the years?
I knew he was going to be going home from the war, and at first I didn't have him jumping off the train. First, I just had him in the fight. And I had started a different way. I can't remember now, but I called my editor and I said, never mind about that first chapter, I'm rewriting it. And I said, he's going to get in a fight. And I think I just had him getting off the train in town. But then I thought, no, the reader needs to realize what Thatcher is capable of. And so I told my editor, I said, I'd send him like the first 100 pages or something. I said, never mind that first chapter, I'm rewriting it. And he said, how? What happens? And I said, well, he gets in a fight on the train. He stabs guy in the hand. He jumps off the train, rolls down the hill, gets all banged up. And he said, oh, he said, well, that's a lot more rip-roaring. And I said, yeah, it is. And so I went with that. But yeah, I wanted the reader to know right away that Thatcher, even though he's tall, dark, you know, the strong, silent type, he has a core, and when backed into a corner, he'll fight, and reluctantly, but kind of a Gary Cooper kind of character, you know, taciturn, but very strong-willed. I think for me, as I said earlier, one thing is just trying to join a scene in progress to where you really don't have to know anything. A good example would be, well, there are two good examples, but I'll use the most recent one, is in Thick as Thieves. And I had no idea where this was going, but I heard this sentence in my head, this piece of dialogue, and it was like, the easiest way to get caught is to talk about it. And I heard somebody say that, and I thought, who was that? Where are they? And I wrote it down. And then all of a sudden, these people were in a ditch looking at this bag of money that they had obviously just stolen. You don't know who they were. You don't know what their story is. And I just wrote that prologue. And then I ended it with, that was at, whatever hour it was. But anyway, it said by sunrise. One was, let's see how to put it. Anyway, one was in the hospital, and one had been caught, one was in the hospital, and one was dead. Okay, now who's going to read that and not want to know who are those people? And so I sent the prologue to my editor, and he was like, "Oh, I love it. What's the rest?" I said, "I have no idea. This is where I'm going to start. This is what I'm starting with. Don't worry so much about acquainting your reader, even with physical characteristics right away. Let their dialogue speak for them so that they start getting, an idea of the terrible trouble that this character is going to get in." And the other thing that I said earlier is plant a question in the reader's mind. And it doesn't it could be as basic as who done it. And you're going to wait the whole book until, the Agatha Christie-esque kind of villain is revealed. Or it can be something very subliminal. It can be like, well, which one died? And how did he die? Which one got caught? Which one's in jail? Which one's in the hospital? That's what I said. I said one was in jail, one was in the hospital, one was in the morgue, and one got away. So you've got 4 characters now. So I asked very basic, planted very basic questions in the reader's mind. Sometimes it's not that obvious, and someone smarter than I've always had this little Post-it, and it says, start with the snake. And so you start with the snake, and then go back and let the reader catch up with you. Oh my God, but it should be something that plants all these questions in their mind. They got to find out what happens next.
CBS News in a recent feature attributed your rare breed of longevity to a bountiful imagination, combined with a hefty amount of discipline, determination, and talent that's resulted in 60 New York Times bestsellers, many of which have been translated into 34 languages, including your most recent global hit, Overkill, which indulges your lifelong love of football as source material. Please take viewers inside the world of the former Super Bowl MVP quarterback Zach Bridger and the cinematic saga that you sent him on here.
The character, for one thing. I'm a big football fan, not so much as of last night. We won't go into that. My team lost on Sunday Night Football, but I love football, grew up on it, being from Texas. And so this is the second book I've written about a football player. The first one was, oh gosh, what's the title of it? Griff was the character, Play Dirty. And so when I was plotting this book, the idea came to me about having to determine whether or not to take someone off life support and how difficult it would be under any circumstances, how much more difficult it would be if you had to do it with a spotlight shined on you. how much more difficult it would be if it were someone you loved. Wouldn't it complicate the matter more if it was someone that you hated? And you still had to make that decision in a public forum, global forum. So I thought, I need somebody really famous. And I was thinking about Tom Brady at that time was trying to decide if he was going to retire or what. And he was, his wife and him were exposed, his children were exposed, family, coaches, other players, everybody, had an opinion. And I thought, make him a football player, a Super Bowl MVP. It's something you're interested in. And so from the get-go, I was interested in Zach's psychology. And I was worried, how in the world is he going to get out of this? How is his problem going to be solved? And I thought, if I'm worried about it, if I'm worried about how I'm going to solve it in the book, then I have to believe the reader from the get-go will be worried about what's he going to do. And that was one way. I mean, I enjoyed seeing the character arc he made. From the recluse, he was bitter. He was, didn't want anything to do with anybody, just everybody leave me alone, to again being thrust in the spotlight and having to cope with it in a much braver way than he coped with it the first time.
Many storytellers that we talk to say they have really no choice but to keep writing until, as Dean Koontz has said, his head falls into the typewriter. What keeps you inspired when you're in that moment of creation working on a new novel?
I've just started, actually. I was working, before our interview, I was working on chapter 2, the end of chapter 2 of a new book. Has no title yet. I know what it's going to be about. I know what the terrible trouble is, and it's very, very contemporary. It will be something, just very much the way Overkill was. Overkill, I wrote, during COVID when families were having to make this awful decision. And so that kind of gave me the idea. This is as contemporary from a societal standpoint. And and I think I've got 2 good characters. They've got a real problem to sort out. So yeah, I'm excited about it, but I can't really talk too much about it because I don't know everything yet. I don't even have a title. It takes me usually 3 or 4 months to do the first draft, because that's when I'm really, feeling my way through the story. And I have a life and I like to live it. And then, but the really best part for me is when the first draft is done and I go back and I write and I rewrite and I rewrite and I rewrite every scene dozens of times until I have squeezed every single thing I can out of that scene.
We'd love to enrich the conversation before we wrap up with any other advice you'd care to share with aspiring suspense authors who might be watching.
Another piece of advice for aspiring writers is something that I learned from David Mamet, the playwright or screenwriter. And every scene, he has 3 questions. What does the character want? What happens if he doesn't get it? Why now? Those 3 things. What does he want? What happens if he doesn't get it? And why now? Because that keeps each scene urgent. And so when I complete a scene, I go back and I say, have I portrayed this? And it can be, he wants the combination to the safe, because if he doesn't get it, there's a beating heart in there. He's got to get to his patient. Why now? Because the patient's going to die if he doesn't. Or it can be something that blatant, or it can be a kiss. It can be, I want a kiss. What happens if I don't get it? she's going to leave me, and why now? Her car is in the driveway running. So it can be, it can be anything, but I put every scene through that exercise to make sure that I've got that urgency and that it propels the story. Because then if the character doesn't get it and he didn't get it in time, you've got to write another scene that makes things worse for him. So it's a propellant, and it also keeps an urgency, a pacing, which is especially important when you're writing a suspense novel. The pacing, I think, is one of the key elements to a suspense novel, is because you're not always trying to find out what happened, like a mystery whodunit. You're waiting to find out who did what happened. Often in a suspense, you're trying to prevent something from happening. So you've got to get there before the bad guy does. And so I think pacing is critical to a suspense novel.
What's it been like to watch some of the movies that have been made of your books play out on the screen?
Not really, because it's usually so removed from what if I were in charge, and I have a problem not being in charge of anything, but if I were in charge, it would have been a completely different movie. But it's like you hand over your baby, to somebody and say, do your best, but it really is like letting go of something that you've created, because when it comes out on the other side, it's not going to be undiluted Sandra Brown. It's going to be what everybody else perceives. Everybody was bringing his or her own creative influences to it. So you just let it go and go to Europe, for 2 weeks.
Your book signings must be quite a trip, as you have as many people walking up in lines with big stacks of your romances, while others are standing behind them or in front of them with big stacks of your romantic suspense catalog titles. What puts the biggest thrill in it for you when you come face to face with fans year after year on book tour, which for you is a global event, given your novels are in print in 34 countries around the world?
Only recently I was in Winston-Salem at the book festival for Bookmarks bookstore there, and I had exactly what you're talking about. I had readers bringing in, shopping bags, books for me to sign, and I said, I'll sign 2, but then you have to go to the end of the line, and let people with their new books get signed, and then I'll stay and I'll sign them all. But so I did that. And most of those, were older readers. One was a man, a gentleman in his senior years, and he waited in line, had me sign every single book for him and his wife, who was not there with him. But then I had a couple of young women who were, I would think, maybe in their 20s, and they said, we were roommates in college, and we started reading your books, and we started, exchange of and talking about them. They said I would read one, she'd read one, but then we swapped. And they had stacks of books for me to sign. And I have to tell you, Jake, that both of those experiences give me a great deal of joy, because that indicates to me that the old books still resonate with people, even though people didn't have cell phones. They were always looking for a payphone, and but a story is a story is a story. And it's why, we don't have to believe in dragons, but we want to read, Game of Thrones because of the story. And so it makes me feel good to know that the story holds up, even if the clothes are different and what they're driving is different, and that younger women are finding the books that I'm writing today as compelling as, the books that were written a long time ago.
So after 80 million books sold internationally, when you do tour the globe meeting fans from so many different countries, who read in so many different languages and see so many different translations of your books, that CBS in their profile spotlighted the fact that Brown has found her books in large and small bookstores around the globe. What have been some of your most powerful connections with readers you've made over the years to reinforce the notion that reading really is the universal language?
I've been to Prague um, on a promotion thing. They were having a book fair and they had invited me several years and it never coincided. What I didn't know until a few years ago is that in those countries that were under Russian regime, the communist regime and the Iron Curtain for decades, 40 years, 50 years, mine were among the first books to get into those countries. And because it was the Harlequin romances, because Harlequin, just because of their juxtaposition, they got books in there when the Iron Curtain fell. And so my books, and I get so much fan mail. I have met so many people from Romania, Bulgaria, the Czech Republic, all in that area, who have said, burst out into tears when they met me. And so I went to Prague and it was overwhelming. It was amazing to me. There was a poster of me in the airport when we arrived. It was like, oh my gosh. And so that it's in a way daunting, but it's also very touching. And the same was true in Japan. I went to Japan at the behest of my publisher over there. And the people were just so lovely, so sweet, and say the sweetest things. And of course, in both countries, I had an interpreter, simultaneous interpreter, so I would understand what they were saying. But these people when would bring me gifts, handmade gifts or something. And I had one, I remember they in Prague, they had driven like a 5-hour drive from their farm, and they brought me homemade cheese from their cows on their farm. And it was just so, that was really touching to think that my stories written about, South Carolina, Louisiana, Texas, North Carolina, that they could reach around the world. And I go back to saying it's not about where or the time period, it is the story. And everyone can relate to the human condition. And it worked for Shakespeare. It worked for writers before Shakespeare. It's worked for every writer since then. You write about people and readers relate to that. Also, anywhere in the world, in any language, you see somebody reading a book and you recognize the title and you say, I've read that book, and you start talking about it, you've immediately made a friend. And I think that books are a bridge that we have not used to bring cultures together. Get people reading the same book, and you've automatically made a connection that language, diplomacy, war have not been able to do.
Well, you did it, though.
It felt good for those time periods when I was there. It really does. And when I get communications, the internet has enabled readers all over the world to be in closer contact. And that just means a lot to me.
In closing, do you feel any sort of a responsibility to your readers, given you've had a loyal run with millions of them for 5 decades now, and we're sure many more to come? And how does that reflect in the elite level that you write at Book In and Out?
Responsibility is a good word, actually, because I do feel a responsibility to them. I feel a responsibility to write the very best book that I can every time out of the gate. And may not be their favorite. It won't be the best book I've ever written, or it could be. But whatever it is, it was the best I could do at the time. I never send in a manuscript that is not as perfect as I can make it. And And by that, I mean, it is as clean as I can make it, but it's also, I may have changed that word 40 times, but it was the best word I could think of. And I feel like I owe whoever is shelling out their hard-earned dollar for that book, I owe them the very best I can give them.
Sandra, it's been an absolute thrill speaking today. Thank you so much for taking out time to be on About the Authors TV.
Thanks so much, Jake.